the far edge of the garrison, and the island behind me, as you can see over there, just across the Sound, is St Agnes. It's known locally just as Agnes, and I don't know if you can make out, but to the right hand side of Agnes are what's called the Western Rocks, and they're possibly the most treacherous part of the seas around Scilly. They go as far out as the Bishop. The Bishop's Rock Lighthouse is very famous. Those of you in the UK will be familiar with it from the BBC adverts with the helicopter landing on the helipad on top of the lighthouse. That's Bishop's Rock. And that in itself is worth a video. But sadly, I don't have time for that. I want to tell you a story about an absolute tragedy that occurred off the rocks off Agnes. In 1707, the Admiral of the fleet, Sir Cloudesley Shovell, was dispatched along with 21 of his ships to the siege of Toulon. Ultimately, the siege wasn't successful, and the British lost. But Cloudesley acquitted himself incredibly well. The French scuttled their own fleet rather than allow Cloudesley to capture and fire it. And the vast majority of those ships weren't salvageable afterwards. So from the point of view of the Royal Navy and Sir Cloudesley, who was an absolute prodigy when it comes to naval battles, he'd started out as a cabin boy and worked his way up to Admiral of the fleet. I mean, he was something really very special. From the point of view of him, it was a glorious success, even though in the grand scheme, the siege of Toulon, the Battle of Toulon, was a disaster for us. But Cloudesley's disaster was to follow on shortly afterwards. He sailed all 21 of the ships back as a group through some pretty terrible conditions, and at this point, navigation was not the fine art that we have today. And somewhere along the way, they lost track of exactly where they were, until they found where they were by hitting Gilston Rocks off the coast of Agnes. 4 ships went down, among them Sir Cloudesley's flagship, the HMS Association. 2 other ships of the line and a fire ship went down, HMS Firebrand. And we don't know for certain, there's no full records, but somewhere between 1,400 and 2,000 British soldiers, sailors, lost their lives in the waters off the coast of Agnes for days afterwards. Bodies were washing up on the beach. It's the greatest loss of life in any single occasion, and Sir Cloudesley was entirely to blame. The myth locally, the story that is told on Scilly, is that on board the HMS Association, the flagship where Sir Cloudesley himself was a Scilonian native. And as the ships approached the rocks and Cloudesley was sailing on unconcerned, not knowing where he was, the man of Scilly announced that the ships and the entire fleet were in grave danger because they were heading onto the rocks off the west of the Isles of Scilly. And the story tells it that the man was flogged and then hanged at the yardarm for mutiny. And well, in all honesty, it's a lovely story, but bearing in mind that every single person on the association lost their life in the disaster that followed, I don't really see any way it can be true. But it's a lovely story, at least from the Scilonian point of view. It underlines this almost uncanny ability that the Scilonian sailors have of knowing pretty much exactly where all the rocks are. And if you've spent any time out here and you've gone off and done any of the boat tours or just travelled between the islands, it's an amazing thing to watch. These guys are fantastic, and this kind of long-standing myth that the Solonian guy on the Association knew exactly where they were fits very nicely with that. But whether it's true or not, we don't know. But anyway, that's Agnes, and that's the story of the greatest naval disaster of all time. I'm here in Porthhellick, and you can see behind me to the right a large natural rock structure known as the Loaded Camel, for fairly obvious reasons. But right now, this little rock here is the one that we're actually interested in. So it was the 22nd of October 1707. Sir Cloudesley Shovell had just driven the Association, the flagship of the English Navy, along with a lot of the rest of his fleet, onto the rocks at Gilston. It had broken the back of the ship, and it had gone down with all hands. Now, most of the sailors either were never found or washed up on Agnes, but Cloudesley somehow managed to miss Agnes completely and wash up right here in Porthhellick on St Mary's, and this stone marks the very spot where his body was found. Now, when he was officially found, he was dead, but the legend has it, at least locally, that when he washed up originally, he was still alive, and a local woman who was particularly poor took a fancy to a large emerald ring he was wearing and killed him and stole his ring. Now, he isn't here anymore. This is just a tiny little memorial of sorts, probably more than he deserves, to be honest. He's now buried in Westminster Abbey in a full glorious carved marble mausoleum, because at the time his earlier achievements were considered more valuable than him wrecking the entire fleet and killing hundreds of his crew.